Okay, there we go. There we go. Well, welcome to the show today. This is part of our series of bringing the issues of race to the forefront and talking about racial issues in our community. My name is A'Jamal Byndon, your host. And with me today is Suzanne Doupnik, who is a single mom and I met her originally at First United Methodist Church when we were doing a deep dive. This is where she had a chance I got to get to know her and also to focus on those racial and community issues that she dealt with in her life and elsewhere. She's been involved in her children's educational experience. She shared a great deal with me about some racial incidents that she's addressed and dealt with. And I invited her to talk more about some of her racialized experience on this program. And it relates to our agenda of more movement in Omaha for race equity. And we're trying to bring more of these conversations to our community. Suzanne works in the hospitality field and balances that with help her children through her educational endeavors. And I know she's very much involved because I've heard some of her stories. And there are a few opportunities for people of color to hear directly from whites who become awoke or understand some of the apartheid conditions in Omaha, and particularly in the state. So first, I'd like to say, Suzanne, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
First, share with the viewing audience a little bit more about yourself.
So I grew up in a small, very white community in Northwest Iowa. The closest place we went where we would see people of color growing up was a mall 30 miles away. And I can probably count on one hand the interactions I had with Black individuals growing up. In my early 20s, I moved to Wichita, Kansas, and took my first position in hospitality, working on computer software for hotels. And it was my first awakening to the real world. I was immediately immersed into a community working with people from all ethnicities, cultures, from around the country, from around the world. And I immediately realized that I loved the exposure. A couple of years later, I accepted a position in Atlanta. And again, a whole new awakening. But I remember one of the things that stands out to me when I think back at race is I remember the first time I heard the claim that the Civil War was not about slavery.
Wow. And
I was sitting at an outdoor restaurant downtown Atlanta with several coworkers, and somehow the topic of Southern history had come up and places I needed to go visit or tour. And I mentioned slavery. And two of the white gentlemen at the table came at me in a very angry tone that was Northerner talk, and that the Civil War was not, in fact, it was not about slavery, it was about manufacturing. I remember sitting there while they came at me with all this, their evidence that the war was not based on slavery. And I remember sitting there thinking, if this changes so much based on location within the same country, what else was I taught growing up that is believed differently throughout the country? From there, a couple of years later, I moved to Phoenix. I spent several years in Phoenix, and it's where I really started to learn about the topic of immigration. And again, what I had been taught, specifically about Hispanic migrants growing up in the Midwest, and how it was so different to the reality. So topic for another day, but yeah, just a huge awakening in my life.
Wow.
I moved to Omaha 15 years ago, have worked from home, traveling back and forth to Phoenix every couple of months since then. My kids have grown up watching me work from home. So I'll be honest, when they grew up with nannies, they grew up with, moms in a meeting lingo. When COVID hit and we had that immediate transfer, everyone's home, everyone's working in different rooms. It really was an adjustment for us because they kind of had seen me throughout their life. And it didn't take long for me to recognize that a lot of that was because of my privilege, that we were able to so easily transition into a stay-at-home situation.
Some months ago, you wrote about your racial experiences as being a white mom with a son who experienced a transformation process as being a student and predominantly going to a predominantly African-American school, and as well as playing basketball with a lot of African-American students and so on. What was that like for you writing and reflecting on those experiences? Give me a little bit more insight into that.
It really, thinking about it and writing about it really brought me back to remembering why I selected where I live. When I was moving here from Phoenix, I had done quite a bit of research on school systems and neighborhoods. Not the research that a lot of parents would think of. I was looking specifically at racial and socioeconomic differences because I knew the upbringing that I had was not the upbringing I wanted my children to grow up and live in. At that point, I don't know how much I knew about what they were going to be in. I just knew it had to look much differently than my upbringing.
And when you say upbringing, you mean all white environment or white enclaves where there was not a lot of diversity. Gotcha.
Yeah, and where most parents are looking at schools because of test scores and accreditations, I was almost looking at the opposite of that, right? None of that played a part. I knew there were other public school districts in Omaha that many people prefer, and it didn't take very long at all for me to know that my kids would be in OPS.
Wow. It's funny you would say that. I know that there are a lot of teachers or administrators who work in the district or will not send their kids to the public schools, and they're reminded of that African proverb, beware of the cook that refused to eat his or her food, So what are we saying? And then the other thing I know, there are people who want diverse experience, but they want the diverse experience of the elites, meaning, it's got to be well income people of color and not necessarily the average grassroots. So there's all kinds of reasons people have, but some of that need to be talked about. How are we making sure we have the balance there? I've met many white liberals who lived in the African-American community or had a deep friendship with African-American but yet they return to their all-white enclaves. What are the challenges that you face from both African-Americans and whites that we should be aware of for addressing racial and racial incidents? Racism and racial incidents, in a sense.
From African-Americans, I think my biggest hurdle is trust. And I get it. Not only a trust situation of why are you trying to help my child, or why are you talking to me, but a trust of my sincerity. I recognize and see the white savior complex is what I call it often.
Right.
And I know it's a slow process. Throughout the years of my son being involved in basketball teams, many were, sometimes he was the only white kid on the team. It's not easy to get past that trust issue, and it takes time. One of his previous teams, I was able to get to a point where I invited mothers into my home, and I considered them friends, and we would socialize. But I'm not going to lie, it took a couple of years to get there. And so I now know with him in high school, and we're kind of starting over, that I have to be patient. And so I approach it of introducing myself frequently, hey, this is my kid. Hey, who's your kid? And I know that repeatedly having those small conversations will eventually show them that I am sincere and I just truly want to be there for the right reasons. With white people, I often see white people want to come in and save the community.
Right.
They want to invite people from North Omaha into their buildings, their meetings, their organizations, but still want to meet in West Omaha.
Right.
They want to fix things. They want to donate money. They want to write a big check. And not that organizations in North Omaha don't need money, but in my experience, writing a check isn't what forms those relationships. And I strongly believe that it takes relational conversation for you really to get the point.
As you're saying that, I'm reminded of sometimes people who swoop in and do what they do and then swoop out. And at the end of the day, the problem is still there because they have not been systematic and long-term agendas in terms of challenging our structures and systems of inequality. By the way, in your essay, you mentioned writing to various public officials about racial incidents, and particularly the Norfolk incident comes to mind. Why did you move beyond just talking about it, which many only did as their only outcomes or outputs to racial and social justice work? So, people talk about Norfolk or talk about an incident that happened at a school or whatever, but they don't do anything about it. So what made you do something beyond that?
In short, when you look at history, nothing happens without resistance, right? Change doesn't come without that. And when I look at the times that I've had to stand up for my children, whether it was maybe taking on the Boy Scout Association years ago on behalf of my daughter, one of the first instances with my son in elementary school was 5th grade. He came home with a teacher note that he had been sent to the office that I had to sign. And when okay, why were we sent, what were you doing? Why were we sent to the office? He said, I took a knee during the Pledge of Allegiance, 5th grade.
Wow.
And we sat and talked. He knew the Colin Kaepernick story. He vocalized it and said he agreed with the grievances that that people should be paying attention. We talked about the military, right? Because that was the stance of the teachers. He knew you and I mutual friends who are military, and so he absolutely had 100% respect for those who have served our country and those who have served to defend us, and knew enough to say that that's the exact reason why we should be able to take a knee, is because they fought for me to have that freedom. Short story, I ended up writing a letter to the school, contacting the administration and saying he absolutely has every right not to participate. We're not even going to have this discussion. And he didn't. And he proceeded with one other student. And when he said, I said, what made you just prompt, not to all of a sudden take a knee? And he said, because there was one Black student doing it alone, and I didn't want them to be alone. I wanted, and right, if my kid gets it, holy cow. And so throughout the rest of that school year, it would come up, he'd have a sub, and the whole thing would get escalated again. Towards the end of the year, a teacher, not even in his classroom, happened to walk by and observe him not participating and pulled him out of the classroom, chewed him out in the hallway. Next day, actually said to Evan, I can't believe your mom hasn't called the school yet because she calls on everything else. I was that mom, right? And so then when I did contact the school, I said, I'm contacting you because the teacher was so concerned that I hadn't contacted you yet. But for the most part, my son had it handled. He knew his rights. He knew he was doing the right thing socially. And, writing letters, contacting officials, it's necessary if we're going to demand change. As we saw with the Norfolk incident, and that's not my first, we'll say my first run-in with the NSAA. I have written them letters on other policies that they have in the past. I'm very familiar with their structure.
By the way, Suzanne, people don't know what the NFA is. That's the Nebraska Student Athletic Association.
Correct. Sorry.
And the Norfolk incidents where the kids were called the N-word after a basketball game, because we didn't explain that either.
My son was playing at that event. The incident did not happen during the boys' game. It actually happened during the girls' game, but we were in Norfolk that night. And I can tell you there's a definite tension with just our own athletes going into we didn't even know that occurred when we left Norfolk that night. But there's definitely a tension amongst the teammates when they go into that environment. Just real quick, I'll share. When we left the game that night, I was transporting another young man with my son back to Omaha, and we stopped at a gas station, and I threw some cash at my son and said, go get you guys some food, drink, soda, whatever, to get back to Omaha. I'm going to put gas in the car. And we got out or they got out, and I start getting gas. And this friend of his turns around 10, 15 feet away from the car and says, would you come in with me? And being dense, I guess, I was like, oh, you just go. Evan's got plenty of money for you. He's got you covered. And he turned around and he walked about another 5 steps, and he turned around and he looked at the store and he looked back at me and said, no, really, will you walk in with me?
Wow.
And it makes me tear up to this day because it hit me immediately. And I was like, oh my God. And I pushed the gas back. I said, yes, I'm on my way. And we got in the car and he actually said, I'm never that scared walking into a gas station in Omaha as I was here. And again, we didn't even know what was happening inside that gymnasium after we left, which is really sad. So yeah. So again, I get back, then I start finding out what happened during the girls' game. And of course, I start contacting all of the directors for the NSAA. I call, I send emails, I start soliciting to get other people to do it. And, you know, in the end, although it wasn't everything I would have liked, it put the school on probation. So I think it shows that if we get involved, right, had more people contacted, it probably would have been more than just probation, but it's a start. And yeah, I think it shows people we have to get involved.
Yeah, I've written a letter because I remember about a couple of years ago, there was a case where they were in Grand Island. They were making fun of the Hispanics or Latinos and saying things about go home and calling them the dirty names and stuff. And so I know this organization is so much inept and incompetent. And matter of fact, the director never wrote me back. I think I wrote to all the board members. But, you know, now they're starting to move because, you know, again, Norfolk has a history of racism and the way they've treated Latinos. And I'm just surprised more people in our community haven't challenged that or in our state. You think Norfolk is Arizona when they were acting the way they were acting years ago towards immigrants. They were, you know, trying to get over and everything. And they were just mean and just nasty about anti-diversity studies and things like that. But yeah, I'm glad you shared that. One of the things, critical aspect of learning about different races, such as African-American, is reading the literature, articles, or books. What have you gained from reading a particular book or article? And by the way, I'm assuming you read books and articles on the African-American experience. Sometimes I make the mistake of thinking everybody reads like I read. I'm like, okay, hold it. Some people may read articles, they may read conversation, you know, whatever. But what's been some of the things you've learned from your experience?
You know, I do read. I go in spurts, and I sometimes switch between what I consider heavy, and then I go read a novel or two just because I need light reading. Okay. But, you know, I've read the standards, White Fragility, How to Be an Anti-Racist, Between the World and Me.
The popular books that are out there on the top 10.
Correct.
I got you.
But, you know, one of the books that probably affected me the most in the last few years is Evicted.
Oh, wow.
And, you know I participated in a book talk or discussion with you at one point a few years ago. I think you were there, but my children and I have spent a lot of time in North Omaha, so we've seen the inequity. But I'll be honest, it wasn't until that book. I grew up poor for most of my childhood. Poor in the essence of we survived on food stamps. My sisters and I, all three, had to have jobs at a very young age to help provide some of the necessities that we needed. But it wasn't until I read that book that I really got, we were rich because we had stability, we had housing stability. My mom was divorced. The house was paid for when my parents divorced. And although we were poor and we struggled, I don't ever remember one time in my childhood wondering, where am I going to sleep tonight? Am I going to have electricity tonight? Right? Like the basics were there. And it wasn't until I read that book, I don't think, that it really hit me, the housing crisis that we have here in Omaha.
Wow.
And then as my son has grown up and we've gotten more involved, and we see it firsthand, it's horrific. I'll just say horrific.
You know,
But-
as you mentioned that the books become the way to transform us. And I remember coming back from the continent after 2 years, and I started reading African novels. I don't normally read novels, but there was something about novels took me to their culture, to places that I had not been. And some of the novels or biographies or books that I've read, it put me in a different light. And so it's almost like when you're teaching a class, and I, as an adjunct back in the day, Black Studies and social work, you can tell the students who read books and who are readers versus those who are, they mimic what other people say. And the same thing with other adults. You know, you see a difference in how you argue, and you can, again, I don't want to deconstruct people who come from an oral tradition, but there are a lot of things that people can capture from other culture and groups by understanding that. And so one of the things I encourage white folks and Hispanics and African Americans and Asians is to read about each other's culture, because sometimes it is not our responsibility to educate you on basic stuff that you should know by just getting the literature. And obviously our school systems do a very poor job in doing some of that, both secondary, post-secondary, and even elementary. So there's something we need to keep pushing at. You got to get folks to be readers and not just you know, the headlines in Facebook in order to learn about culture and race issues.
Well, and you know, I just recently, based on your recommendation, I just started reading Caste.
Oh, wow.
And I'm maybe 40 pages into it, but again, no, this is going to be a life-changing book for me to read. Yeah.
Right. You know what's fascinating? I have always had a top 10 list of books that can change my life. I would point to, like, some people I would say to you, what are your top 10? Some will say the Bible. Some will have all kinds of books. But I would tell you this Caste jumped into my top 10 because the way Isabel Wilkerson wrote about the narrative of slavery, and she compared it with Nazi Germany and how the Indians are in India are treated, and how we assume our position sometimes because we've been socialized in it. And sometimes we fight against it in an indirect way or a direct way. But it's the way she writes. She's such a clear writer. She's a journalist. So she doesn't write heavy from an academic point of view, but she
No,
has
it's
her
understandable. Sometimes thick books intimidate me.
Yeah, it is a long book. I tell you, it take a while, but
it's not
fascinating when you
intimidating
read
to
that book.
read. Yeah, not intimidating to read at all. It's
but I encourage people to read it. And then I had a chance to meet her when she came to Omaha some years ago, about 5 years ago, when she was out at a countryside, and she was talking about the other book that she got a award for, The Warmth of the Other Sun, which is the migration of many African Americans from the South out of some of those cesspools and plantation environments and negativity of semi-slavery type environments of apartheid in the United States. I was going to ask you a different question is, and this is an interesting one, I think, from my perspective, is how do you define friendship? For example, when I was at work at Catholic Charities, one of the white board members, we were doing table talks, and she actually called me her friend. I'm like, friend, you're a board member? We might be, I didn't use the word frenemies back then, but she mentioned, I told her based on some of the words, we're not friends because I had not been to her home, and you know, she didn't know my wife, I didn't really know her husband. And others might differ with that definition of friendship, particularly when you talk about racial line. My question specifically is, have you ever been in the homes of African-American, the families of African-American youth you transported? You alluded to that. And then also, what is it like for you, or what is that not like for you in interacting with those particular families of different racial groups? It's kind of a loaded question and it's convoluted, but how do you define friendship, particularly racially, because sometimes we do that differently. And then how do you define, or how have that been for you as a white person interacting with African-American, the parents of some of those students you've transported and helped out?
I'll be honest, my circle of friends is small. Part of that is my nature. I've never had a lot of friends. I've got a pretty small, tight circle. And when I say friend in that term, I mean like the people I call when I'm crying because something happened at work, or you know, those kind of
things. Like your tight friends, tight friends. Yeah. Gotcha.
I'm not into big crowds, so gatherings of 1 or 2 people are just fine for me. And I'll be honest, part of it's gotten worse at my age, because part of me is at my age, I don't have the time or the will to spend with people who don't get it. I just, I try.
Hold it. Help me there. I'm gonna stop. You say don't get it. What do you mean they don't get?
They don't get the need to be concerned about race in this country.
Got you. Okay.
Right. It's sometimes it might be, LGBTQ topics or things like that. But for the most part, the people that choose not to be awakened, they get so many chances with me, and then it's just, you're out. Like,
you have three chances, you're out, huh?
Yeah, it's, but you mentioned how it might be different based on race, and it is for me. Like I mentioned earlier, right? It took me a couple of years to get to the point where I was comfortable inviting those women into my home, and they came and we could talk. And now kind of, I'll be honest, it's more, I see these parents at games. I try to sit as close to them as you can in COVID times to engage in conversation. There's one dad in particular that is playing on a summer team with my son. His son is, and last night I saw him walk in at the end of practice, and I, waved and said, "Hey, I'm so glad that the boys are, playing as a team this summer." And, Evan's so excited. And he came and pulled up a chair and sat next to me. And I considered that a big win. Like, I know I'm not going to call him and say, "Can we go for coffee?" But I felt like that trust, right? That's starting to be there. And then, towards the end of the conversation, he had mentioned that he knows that I transport, not his child, but some of the kids. And I said, if you ever need help, I have a job that during the day I can happen to leave. And if I do a call on my phone in the car, it's fine. Like, and he was very appreciative and said, "I may have to take you up on that because I work nights sometimes." And so it does look a little bit different, I think, based on, it's interesting. I can be open. 2 houses up from us was a Black family that has lived there about 4 or 5 years. They had 2 sons, the age of my kids, and both very athletic. So there was just, lots of playtime outside. And a few weeks ago, we saw that a sold sign had went up in their yard. And, first of all, we're losing kids out of the neighborhood, right? So we're losing playmates. And for me, it's like we're losing another Black family. And I don't want that. And my son came in the house this weekend, and I said, "Hey, did you see there's a moving truck up the street?" He said, "Yes, you'll be happy, Mom. It's another Black family." And so he knows, right? He knows that helps our neighborhood. He knows that helps those interrelationships that we need in our community so badly, because there's just not enough of it going on across the city.
Right.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, I was talking to somebody who's a Creighton graduate, a recent graduate, and they told me during the orientation, Creighton University told them not to go to North Omaha. And just so happened this individual lived in North Omaha, because as she finished the orientation, she started to walk down the street towards North Omaha from campus. And the person said, "Why are you going there?" And she said, "I live there." And again, it's that mentality of real estate agents, as school officials, as university officials, you name it. They want to stigmatize North and South Omaha as negative. And now you see the regentrification also happening, but we got to be careful how we demonize people's areas and communities where they have families and you name it. But it brings up another point. Karen and I was doing cultural humility training at Metro one time. And I remember the majority of the group, it was white people, particularly white women. And towards the end of it, we got to talk about friendships and relationships and things like that. And I remember there were 2 white women who literally said, "How can I have Black friends? I live in an area where everybody's white." And I didn't have the answer for them, because I told them I already had my 4 or 7 white friends. So I got my quota, I'm good. I said it with a straight face too. And so I turned to Karen, who's white, and I says, "Karen, can you give them some advice?" And so it was interesting to hear that conversation. But in order to have a friend, you got to be a friend. And also you got to make sure you're astute enough to be able to hold a conversation about people's interests. And again, some of us grew up in these segregated apartheid communities such as Omaha, and we don't have a clue how to interact racially unless we take a course on it.
I think I look at things, and this probably comes from some of my work training, but you have to look at things and what your end in mind is. I use that term often with my employees. I don't approach what I do because I'm looking to add to my list of Black friends. I understand why it's uncomfortable for many Black people to invite a middle-aged white woman into their home. I get it.
Right.
Like,
Right.
But I do want to raise my kids to see those inequities. And each one of us has an obligation to right the wrongs. And if you are not going into that so that you have your little tally that says, see, I've got a Black friend, we went to dinner, we have coffee. Yeah, I just think, yeah.
And there are people who do that. Matter of fact, sometimes in our sessions and education environments, I hear people say some slip kind of word like, well, I got one, or, whatever, but it's kind of sad. One of the ironies of aspect of your love for the public, ironies, I know ironic somewhat, is you have a strong love for the public schools, despite their flaws. And many people know I have a certain kind of love for them too. But many white parents, if they have problems in the public schools or the district, they just put their kids in a private white school. Why haven't you done that? Why haven't you not done that in spite of all the snafus and things you see happen inside the Omaha Public Schools, for example?
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I get offered, I get questioned that a lot. Why haven't you just moved your kids out to one of the area schools? But I'll be honest, for me, it goes against the principles of what I believed when I moved here and I decided how I wanted to raise my children. Kind of goes back to that, parents, they look at test scores and accreditation, and they think that's what sets their kids up for success. Well, they went to a school that has awards and, they have a 98% graduation rate. And so, a high percentage of kids that go on to a 4-year college. And I think they're missing the boat completely. We live in a world where we should all feel obligated to care for each other. Right. A world in which all people have to be treated fairly and given the same opportunity. And that doesn't happen if we're not in community together. It's never going to happen. And that's what we see in our segregated city today.
Right, right. So Suzanne, one of the things that one of the things I wanted to share is that when I would talk to you at some point about writing about your experiences, I think it was a long time from the time I talked to you about it and the time that you sent me something, because a lot of people don't always like writing. Again, I understand that. But my question is, what was the incident or reason for making you write? Why now? What made you write about your experiences? And by the way, explain, there was a narrative you wrote about some of these narrative experiences you shared today that you shared with me. But what took you so long?
To be honest, A'Jamal, you challenged me. From the time we did the racial dive together, which I probably changed my life more than most events in my life. I'm aware, right? I try to be constantly aware. I try to be constantly aware of my privilege and how that's reflected and how I'm using that. But one of the first questions you asked me 5 months ago was, what have I done in the last 6 months to fight racism? And it's a straightforward question, but it hung me up. When I sorted out all the COVID crap, right? Because, okay, I get a few passes because we've all been locked up for so long. I had to really examine how I was continuing my personal education, right? How I was continuing the day-to-day activities that I do with the students or with my son. That's just who I am. But I want to do better at the big things. I want to continue to recognize that every day is a teaching moment, but it's tackling the system that is more challenging.
Right. As you say that, one of the things that I learned, and I learned this, it took me a while because I'm not the sharpest blade, as they say in the room, in a sense, or the sharpest arrow. But one of the things my wife taught me was the concept of not doing. Sometimes she says that can be just as powerful as doing. And sometimes you look at some of the so-called friends you have, and you're in a crisis or you're fighting against, it's like David and Goliath, use that metaphor. You're in the middle of thick and thin. And she had the same experience somewhat at work from time to time where she would have to speak out or say something and people run up after her and say, oh, I'm glad you said that. And her comment was, why didn't you say something? Or you may be a part of a union and you get benefits of people who are not part of the union, yet they want to acknowledge you're fighting and going toe to toe against these oppressors in a sense. And then the other thing I think is very important is that we are defined by what we do. I mean, I remember many Native American proverbs and issues where they describe the hand or they describe, we are what our hands are doing or something. So yeah, these are very important issues that we need to do, but I really appreciate the feedback. My other question is, do you have any peers, meaning other whites who get what you're talking about in these interviews or these essays? In other words, do you have peers?
Who fully get it?
Who fully get it?
Yeah, a few.
Not the many, but the few.
Yeah.
Okay.
My experience in many organizations that I've been involved with here is that there are a lot of progressives in Omaha. It was one of the things that I liked about Omaha when I moved here, and I still like. But saying you get it and putting it into action are two different things. So I use the LGBTQ narrative often because I think it's easier for me to, I'm a huge supporter. I'm a big advocate in that arena as well. And in my experience in Omaha, many people, churches, organizations really rally behind the LGBT community. I think because of the advances that community has made in the last 20 years, you almost have to live under a rock today to not know somebody who they themselves are LGBTQ or have a family member or a friend, right? So almost everybody today on this earth has a personal connection to somebody who lives LGBTQ. Now, almost everybody also knows somebody who's Black or sees people who are Black, but they're not in relation with them. And so I think if you don't have that story, you can't connect. And so I have a lot of white friends who believe in anti-racism and they believe in all the causes, and they will even show up at rallies and protests. And I love them for that. But if you don't know the story, if you don't put yourself in those areas to really see the struggle, I don't think you ever get it. I don't, yeah.
As you share that, it reminds me of two things. One is, I've been very much sensitive to what happened during the Holocaust. And in my last year of teaching at Black Studies at UNO, I made a notion say I will not talk about slavery or the Holocaust or genocide as apart from each other. Because if you look at it, you got people going through these school systems talking about the Holocaust who are people of color who've never talked about how people of color have treated during their Holocaust. I had a former boss said I shouldn't use that term because it only belongs to Jewish people. Like, give me a break. You got Rwanda, you got Bosnia, you got all kinds of crazy things that are happening where thousands of people are killed in genocide and so on. The other issue I find somewhat problematic is when I look at the ADL, Anti-Defamation League, on the national level, and I look at all their Jewish staff members and I look at their white or their Jewish board members and they're talking about hate and racism and stuff. I'm like, there's something wrong with that picture. It's appropriation. It'd be just as evil or bad of me to talk about Native American issues and I have a major organization and I appropriate their struggles for whatever their independence is and never hire one or have any in our board and so on. So one of the things I'm going to argue emphatically is that if we're going to deal with people's pain and so on, it's not the pain game per se, which they will say on one level, but we're the descendants of those respective things that have given people the privilege to be where they're at. But let's say we disagree on a lot of points. The fact that you can't even articulate certain things about how the Palestinians are being treated can be another problematic issue in our society. So in a free country, freedom of speech, you shouldn't lose your job because you have a different point of view about people who are oppressed. And so that's something we need to grow up with and deal with, but I really appreciate you sharing that.
There's two real quick things. The ADL you mentioned, a few years ago, my son was invited to participate in the leadership summit. Identified one of 7 kids from his school to go participate in a citywide summit. The day he went, he came home and, oh, how was it? I was all excited. It was downtown. He said, well, first he said, of the 7 kids from Morton, I was the only white kid. He said, so that was different. I mean, that was interesting. And I said, well, okay. He said, but our bus was late and we got to the event late and we were the last school to arrive and everyone was sitting and our table was at the front. So we had to weave through all the tables, right, to get to our table. And when we walked in, it was immediately aware that there was maybe 2 other people of color in the whole room.
Wow.
And our whole congregate I was the only white kid in my school. And
wow.
So he came home that night and said, Mom, I've never been so proud to be with my school than I was today going through there. The other story I'll share real quick is, in all the conversations I've had with these young men over the last several months, going to games and practices and all that, I've been so impressed with how frank these young men will be with me in the car. And I'm a pretty candid individual, so I think they realize that. But multiple times, multiple boys have said to me, I am the first white woman to ever talk to them about white privilege.
Wow.
And about racism here in Omaha.
Wow. And they go to the public school system?
And they have shared with me their stories of family members being, victims of violence, friends, their incidents walking into stores, all of that. And I think we have a problem in our community when 15-year-old men who have lived here their whole life and gone to our public school system their whole life, when I'm the first white woman to ever speak to them about racism in our city.
Wow. It reminds me of, I was invited to speak to 2 white women who teach in cultural diversity at UNO. And one of them was in, I think, the counseling field, and she adopted a Black kid, apparently. And she said she lucked into the job. She was just at the right time, the right place, but didn't have a clue what she was doing. It was obvious they just picked somebody off the street and let her teach that because she had a master's degree. The other person I went to her class is public administration, and I could tell the way the course was outlined and laid out, and even who was in the class, they were not having the serious discussions that we need to have. In the School of Social Work, there was a white guy, professor who just graduated from the University of Chicago, and he was using the New York Times as his race studies. And this was probably about 5 years ago before the 1619 project. So he was just grabbing random articles out and not even really using a textbook per se. But it was embarrassing to see him. And even his comment was like, oh, they loaded this class on me like it was some badge of negativity. But again, when you have departments and leadership who don't take this seriously, or you got departments who don't challenge each other about notching up the game plan, you get that kind of stuff. But it's a shame in 2021 or 20 that you got students who are supposed to go to an integrated, diverse school, not have academicians. But again, look at the School of Education. Look who they got teaching culture diversity out there. Some of them give the ones who are aggressive or progressive, or even words aggressive, but progressive. Yeah, they could be aggressive about anti-racism, but they don't give them the kind of accolades that they deserve. And so that is sad to hear that. And again, I appreciate you sharing that, because a lot of the people in our community don't hear that. And they need to hear more of these conversations for us to notch our game up in this community and in our state, because we got a governor that says
young people want to have these discussions.
Right.
Like these boys have never shied away from me when we're in the car and I say white privilege, or we recently had a whole carload and we were driving in North Omaha somewhere, and there was these big, beautiful condominiums going up. And I said, all right, boys, what is that called? And like in unison, I heard gentrification.
Reminds me of the land bank, Omaha Land Bank. The director got a new director. I called her. She didn't return my call.
My son's looking at me like, oh my God, Mom, stop.
No, these folks come off in here and they hijack everything. And you go to New York and some of these big cities, they're like, what? And Washington, D.C. no longer is considered a chocolate city because everybody's moving closer to those old brownstones and taking over. And again, people can't afford the taxes on some of those places. But these are the conversations we need to have. We're getting close to the end, but I want to ask you, what is the most important concept that you would share with our listening audience from your experiences?
I want to say that it's speak out when you see racism. And although I know that's critical, I don't think that happens until you start understanding the stories. And I don't think you can really understand the stories if you really want to help equal the playing field and you truly want to see an end of a segregated city here. You need to thoroughly examine, and this isn't going to surprise you, where you spend your money, where you spend your time, and where you spend your talent. If you do not do that often, I just don't think you get it. You have to be comfortable being uncomfortable.
Right.
And you have to be comfortable in settings where, as a white person, you may be the only one or you're in the severe minority.
Right.
Since our deep dive, because this was a topic that came up there frequently, I can tell you that we have sought out, we have African-American doctor, dentist, plumber. When I need services at my house, I'm constantly on Google looking in North Omaha to find businesses to uplift that part of our community. There was recently a tree trimming company in a neighborhood that I noticed all of the people up in the trees were of color. Mm-hmm. And so I circled the block 2 or 3 times because I was trying to find a logo or something. And my son finally made me pull away. He's like, Mom, they're going to think you're harassing them or you're a Karen, knock it off. So I had to leave and I couldn't figure out who it was. But, I'll end this because I truly believe you have to live it. I recently, over the weekend, put a post up. My kids and I had been at the IMA wreath laying ceremony for MLK on Easter. And on our way home, we stopped at an ice cream establishment and got some ice cream. And on our way home from there, my son says, that was the most awkward experience ever. And I'm like, what do you mean? And he said, Mom, it was all white people in there. And I said, there was 1 or 2 Black employees though. What are you talking about? He said, the place was busy and there was no customers that were Black or of any other culture. And I said, oh, I guess you're right. And then my daughter goes on to say, yeah, that was really bad, Mom. And I'm like, okay, seriously, and my son came back at me and said, Mom, but that just isn't who we are. He said, you don't shop at stores. You don't get groceries. He said, we don't go anywhere that's all white anymore. And he said, he said it was awkward. And I walked away from it thinking, if my kids never learn anything from me again, A'Jamal, I've done my job. I've done well, that they recognize it. They see it now before I see it. And they know it's not okay.
Right. Well, Susan, I totally appreciate that. Matter of fact, one of the things that I share with the folks is I count races or in terms of diversity, in terms of meetings I go to, and I have a hard time doing that sometime during working hours, because again, I've been in many meetings where they're talking about issues in our community, both North and South Omaha, with Latinos, Native Americans, Asians, you name it, African Americans, and yet there's not one person of color in the room but me sometime. And it's a tremendous burden to be the only one. And I oftentimes use the example of being the only woman in the room when you're around a bunch of men. And how does that feel? And people get that feeling when they're talking about gender issues or whatever. But more than anything is that if we're as diverse as we say we are in multicultural, then how come our environments don't reflect that, or even the ways that we behave in terms of the public square? Again, what people do sometime in their private life is one thing, but one of the things I've made a vow is that I'm not going to volunteer and be a part of all white groups or groups that don't allow different points of view in to deal with some of the craziness in this society. So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your experiences. And again, this is reflective of our group movement in Omaha for race equity, because there are very few groups in this city and in this state that has made it part of their mission to deal with anti-racism issues, particularly the 450 years of oppression that many African Americans and Hispanics and Native Americans have experienced. And Asians, obviously, we see some of the recent crazy stuff going on, and had a colleague says we should take a position. And my response was, take a position on what? I mean, let's bring folks in our circle and let them help us grow and make sure that they can help lead it. But who am I to put a statement out that has no substance, is going to move beyond the rhetoric of many of these other elite organizations or, so on. So I really appreciate you coming on, sharing your
Absolutely.
experience. And this hopefully is a teaching modality for many of us in our communities because we can learn from each other. As that old Zen proverb goes, sometimes it's hard to tell the student from the pupil and the teacher from the pupil in a sense because they interchange. The teacher and the pupil can be one. So these are very important
Thank
issues.
you.
Thank you.
All right.
So folks, we hope you enjoyed this edition and hope turn to our webpage as we continue to post interviews and conversations about racial equity issues and anti-racism things. And have a good day. And as we always end, Baroko.